Well, hello everyone. Look how cool I look in my glasses. Woo! What? It's reflecting the world back to me. I think, well, that's really powerful. All right, today we're going to be looking at voting rights. Who has had the right to vote and how long have they had the right to vote? What is that? My glasses are really distracting. It's creepy because you can't see what's going on with my eyes. Okay. All right. All right. It's fine. All right. So right now for the next few minutes, you're going to sit and get. That means you're going to sit and listen and take in information. You're going to sit and think about that information, and you're going to sit and discover possibly new things that you didn't know before. Teachers, I want to remind you that you can always click the pause button or the pause button. You know what I mean. So students, right now, you need to have your PBL notebook out in front of you. And we're going to be filling in these notes as we go over the next few minutes. So you need your PBL notebook, and you need to actually have something to write with. Are you good? Can you see the screen? Can you hear my voice? I'm going to close caption this one so that even if you cannot hear everything I say, you'll be able to read it at the bottom of the screen. Cool, cool, cool? Okay, all right. Oh, whoa. Did anybody? Okay, crazy. Okay, so, haha, woo, let's get ready for some notes. All right. Okay, all right. So, you think you can vote. This is a brief history of America's voting rights. So, in the early years of our country, when colonists are going to come over from England, they're going to bring English political law and customs with them. That just makes sense. So here's what you're going to write down for your notes. So each one of those little blanks, those little blocks is going to fly away and you'll fill those in. Teachers, you may want to pause it after this, after all the blanks get pulled in, because the children will need them. But I will talk for a little bit. Okay, so in colonial times and during the early years of our country, men had to prove, notice it says men had to prove that they owned property or land in order to be able to vote. And this idea comes from English laws and customs. So that's a very small group of people. If you need to pause it at this time, please feel free to do so. So many people believe that landowners were the only ones responsible enough to make political decisions. Okay, so who is that going to leave? This is going to leave out poor white men, women, American Indians, and Africans, both free and slave, out of the voting process. And this is going to be for hundreds of years. I mean, women don't get the right to vote until 1920, right? 150 years into our nation's history. Okay, so independence in the vote. The framers, that's framers, not farmers, two different, some were farmers. Anyway, okay, so the framers of the Constitution couldn't agree on who should have the right to vote. So you know what? They punted. They gave each state the power to decide what its own voting rights would be. So what you'll see in the United States is there are some commonalities, but that has come from the things that we'll be learning about today, which is either federal law or amendments to the Constitution. Do you recognize anybody from the image? Teachers, you might want to pause it at this point. I see George Washington in the center. Apologize. I will stop singing. But it just comes to me so naturally. All right, moving on. Oh, hey, it gives me the answers? What had I not anticipated? All right, so Benny Franks, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and John Adams. Those handsome devils. So over time, states are going to drop the requirement that voters must own property. But here's the thing, you guys. Some states are going to act fast and some are slow. New York got rid of the property requirement in 1821. So it was like 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, for crying out loud. Rhode Island doesn't get rid of this until 1880. Yeah, that's pretty crazy that that was a requirement on the books until that time. So here we go. All adult men were guaranteed the right to vote in the year... Oh, sorry, that came in a different order than what I thought it was. In the year 1870, when the 15th Amendment was passed. Now, this is right after the Civil War, and most of you guys don't have a good, firm, solid foundation, but slaves are freed in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. Then in 1868. They're given citizenship through the 14th Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment gives African American men, so it gives all men in the United States who are citizens the right to vote. So here's what it says. The amendment states, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that means race, color of your skin, and then whether or not your family used to be enslaved. Okay? So teachers, if you need to pause it, feel free to do that. So there's a lot more to this. The 15th Amendment said that former slaves could not be turned away from the polls due to the color of their skin or that they had been slaves, but there's way more to the story that develops. Because if you think about it, what is Martin Luther King Jr. fighting for 100 years after this? He's still fighting for the rights of African Americans to be able to vote 100 years after the Constitution said they could. All right, so this is like one of those little things you can just give your teacher a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Let's see if we think this person can vote. The year is 1915. I'm a single African-American man living in Chicago, Illinois. Do you think I can vote? Thumbs up for yes, thumbs down for no. Now, Chicago is in the northern part of the United States. That's supposed to be a big hint because we're going to say yes, we think that he actually could vote. Now, let's look at the women's right to vote. By the way, we will circle back to civil rights in just a moment. So women gained the right to vote after a long, hard fight. Wyoming, I know, is it even a real state though? I mean, I watched this Garfield episode when I was a kid that said Wyoming wasn't real, so I'm pretty sure this is made up. Okay, it's not. All right. Fake news. Got it. Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1869, but it took the work of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and many, many others to get the job done. Oh my gosh, I just totally got stopped for a really long conversation, and I don't remember where I was, but those really nice old women on the right are Susan B. Anthony, who's standing up, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that's Katie, not Caddy, Stanton. And so they're going to petition for women's rights, and they fought for the right to vote for 75 years. Yeah, that's right. So this, you need again to grab up your paper. Women were guaranteed the right to vote in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. Which state gave women the right to vote first? Do you remember? Do you remember? Is it even real? Wyoming? And that was in 1869. So here's what the 19th Amendment says. It's not that complicated. It says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of sex, and that means gender. So this is when women got the right to vote. Teachers, if you need to pause it for all of your students to get this written in, go for it at this time. But for real kids, you can get this written in. You got it. We don't have to pause it every time. All right, let's see. Can this lady vote? I'm a woman living in New York City in the year 1924. I'm married and I have 2 children. Can I vote? I will tell you, I am not really sure what being married and having 2 kids has to do with it, but I know the year 1924 is important. So thumbs up, thumbs down. Can this nice lady vote? Yes. Yes, you can vote. All right, let's talk about Native Americans or American Indians, or First Nations, or Indigenous peoples. That's right, there's a lot of names. I'm not really sure which the right one is. So this is a crazy stat. American Indians were not considered citizens of the United States until 1924. Yeah, 1924. So like even though they were the first people here, first people from somewhere else to come here 12,000 years ago across the land bridge, they didn't become citizens until 1924. Before that, they were considered members of their own tribal governments. And even today, this is a complicated issue. You might have some Native Americans that actually don't have United States passports. They have it from the Chippewa or the Cherokee or the Mohawk Native Americans of their own tribes. All right, grab that paper. American Indians were given U.S. citizenship and the right to vote in the year 1924 when the president signed the Indian Citizenship Act. Woo, kids over there getting a bit spicy. Who was the president at that time? It was President Calvin Coolidge, who has a really cool name but wasn't the coolest guy. I mean, I don't really know much about Calvin Coolidge. I guess it's good that he did this. Okay, all right, moving on. Do you think you can vote? I'm an American Indian living in Montana in the year 1910. I'm 65, married, have 3 kids and 7 grandkids. Can I vote? Notice that year, 1910. Can this person vote? No, 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 they cannot vote. All right, moving on. Residents of the District of Columbia. This is absolutely crazy. So, people who lived in our nation's capital, down the street from the president, did not gain the right to vote until 1961 when the 23rd Amendment is passed. So I remember this one, DC 23. So if you look on the map, is Washington in Virginia or is it in Maryland? Or is it Washington State that's located 3,000 miles away? No, it's actually not located in Maryland or in Virginia. It's in between. It's like bass. You know, sorry, that was a really loud bass sound. Okay, so that's pretty cool that they finally got the right to vote. Now here's the thing. It's only 3 electoral votes, so they get to vote for president, but they still can't vote for members of Congress. They have no representation in Congress. Okay, had another meeting. Everything's fine. So, DC is a really awkward place because you know that whole entire no taxation without representation thing? Yeah, DC has no representation in Congress, none, and Congress is in charge of taxing Washington, D.C. So the official license plate in Washington, D.C. says taxation without representation. That's a problem. So you think you can vote? Can my husband and I vote for my neighbor, the president? I don't know why she talks like that. I don't know why she's rooting for the Blue Jays, but this is just where it's at. I'm going to just go back to my normal voice. I live in Washington, D.C., just down the street from the White House. The year is 1955. I'm a 35-year-old woman with 2 children. Can I vote? Well, can you vote for the president in 1955? No, you could not. You can't vote until 1961 when the 23rd Amendment passes, giving D.C. 3 electoral votes in the presidential election. I wonder what you're hearing from the other room. It's very interesting. All right, so we do need to circle back to what we started with the 15th Amendment after the Civil War. So voting is a civil right. Many people in the South did not want African Americans to have the same rights as white Americans. That's just a fact. That's a really hard fact. It's really hard to wrap our heads around. And this included the right to vote or hold office or serve on a jury. Phone, timeout. So that was no one. It was somebody calling to ask me to vote. So that's cool. Thank you. Speaking of voting, so what happens is that some states, specifically all across the southern United States, they're going to pass laws that make it impossible to vote. So just to let you know, voting was done on a state-by-state basis. Remember that from earlier in our presentation that our founding fathers, well, and mothers, but really it was founding fathers. Founding fathers, the founders of the United States, there you go, our founders, all right? They couldn't decide what to do about voting, so they just left it in the hands of the states. And so that's why states could determine whether or not they discriminated against different people. So here's some of the barriers that existed. States and individual counties used a whole bunch of different methods. So they limited opportunities to register to vote. You could be beaten up or arrested by the police. We are going to be talking about this later when we talk about an incident that happened in Ocoee on Election Day in the year 1920. Just down the street from us, in fact. The threat of violence toward a voter's family and home. Personal information shared with groups like the Ku Klux Klan and maybe your employer, and your employer would say, if you vote, you're fired. Unfair tests at the poll. So what do we mean by these things? So when we're talking about a poll test, this is one of them that existed. To correctly guess the number of cotton balls in the jar before you're allowed to vote, or to guess how many bubbles are in a bar of soap. P.S. There's not answers to the second one that you could possibly know. Literacy test is one type of poll test that was given in some locations. Voters were tested on their reading skills. So if you look at that political cartoon, it's supposed to be two white guys, and they're not really dressed in fancy clothes. And the guy voting, sitting down, says, by the way, what's that big word? And it says, voters take literacy test here. And so the sheriff is in it. And here's what you need to know. This is trying to tell you that white voters, even if they were struggling readers, even if they were illiterate, they almost always passed. And African American voters usually failed. So here's some of the voting requirements in the South. In Alabama, you had to read a section of the Constitution out loud. Tell what the section says in your own words. Write out another section of the Constitution. Answer 8 questions on the Constitution. Louisiana, you had to prove you had a 5th grade education. Well, here's the thing. It's really difficult to prove you have a 5th grade education if there aren't schools. Yeah, I know, tough. 30-question test, finish it in 10 minutes. And so many African Americans lack the ability, access to education. They had the ability, but they lacked the access to education. And white people didn't always have to take these tests, or sometimes they were given the answers ahead of time. So the goal of this was to exclude people, because the Fifth Amendment says you can't exclude someone based on race. But they're not excluding people on race. They're excluding somebody based on their inability to answer questions correctly. I know, very tricky. So here we go. This is an example of an Alabama literacy test. In what year did Congress gain the right to prohibit the migration of persons to the United States? 1808, right? So it goes ahead and asks you some questions. I'm going to skip down to Louisiana's most special literacy test. Number 20, spell backwards forwards. 21, print the vote upside down but in the correct order. 22, place a cross over the 10th line in this letter, a line into the first space in the sentence, and a circle around the last the in the second line of the sentence. Oh, did you get all that? Right? Exactly. There are 30 of those, and you had to be able to do it in 10 minutes. Yeah, pretty crazy. So then there was something called the grandfather clause, and it said you have the right to vote only if your grandfather also had the right to vote. And here's the thing, you guys. Sorry, my slide just went forward. The thing about the grandfather clause is people would be like, yeah, but your grandfather enslaved my grandfather. Yep, so I guess you can't vote because it's not based on previous condition of servitude. It's based on whether or not your grandpa could vote. Right. Next, we have poll tax. So the poll tax is going to require voters to have the ability to pay. So, for example, most Southern African Americans were poor sharecroppers that were heavily indebted. They didn't have money, right? Most poor white people didn't either, by the way. So even though that this poll tax only was $1.50 to vote, in today's money, adjusted for inflation, that would have been $23 per vote. So here we go. Although the 15th Amendment said that race could not keep men from voting, some states prevented African Americans from voting. Name 3 barriers. So I'm going to list 3 barriers, but we told you about a lot of them. So literacy tests, the grandfather clause, saying you can only vote if your grandpa could vote, and poll tax. There are tons of other barriers too. Remember, intimidation, being threatened, sometimes violence against them, being told that they'll tell your boss that you voted and then you might get fired from your job. That's a huge problem. So these are some of the main ways that African Americans were prevented from voting. And so this is actually why the United States government gets involved in the process, because of the 14th Amendment that says you and me and everybody here in the United States is guaranteed equal protection under the law. Well, does it seem like everybody was being equally protected and their right to vote was? No. So this is where the federal government gets involved. So here we go. Do you think I can vote? I'm a 22-year-old African-American man living in the Deep South in 1948. I work in cotton fields and cannot read or write. Now, you know that in 1870, it said he had the right to vote. However, it's not likely that you get to vote in the South, especially if you were illiterate. More on the civil rights movement. Over time, more and more people demanded civil rights for everyone in America. That's one of the #1 things that Dr. King was fighting for, not just the rights of African Americans, but the rights of everyone. So you have marches and speeches and sit-ins and freedom rides and activities, and this adds up to the civil rights movement. In civics, we're going to be doing a deep dive into this topic in January. For everybody else, you'll be doing it next year. So then we have to change some things. Remember what I was talking about with the poll tax? Well, we add the 24th Amendment in 1964. So 1964, and it banned the use of poll taxes in elections. Hey, can you name two people in this image? I know I can name one of them. You see President Lyndon Baines Johnson and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So then you also have the Voting Rights Act, signed by President Johnson in 1965. And what it did is it reinforced and supported the 15th Amendment. It protected the right of citizens, for all citizens to vote, and it forced the states to obey the Constitution. P.S. Just in case you're wondering, states have to obey the Constitution. It's like Article 6 of the Constitution. You got to obey it. And then it reinforced the 15th Amendment. So, all right, so you need to grab your notes again. The Civil Rights Movement brought changes to the voting laws and practices in the United States. One really important thing is that the 24th Amendment banned what? In 1964, poll taxes, right? That's the $1.50 translated into money today would be $23. So that's $46 per family. And there wasn't a lot of money around. What was then passed in 1965? The Voting Rights Act. That's right, the Voting Rights Act. All right, next we have lowering and changing the voting age. So in the 1960s and 70s, hundreds of thousands of young men, specifically young men, were drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. But many were too young to vote because at the time the voting age was 21, not 18. It had been since pretty much the beginning of our country. And so they chanted this kind of old enough to fight, old enough to vote. And sometimes they said old enough to fight and die, old enough to vote. So what you need to write down, Constitution changed the voting age from 21 to 18 when the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971. Which war influenced this change? The Vietnam War. All right, guys, this should bring you through your entire set of notes at this time. And the 26th Amendment says the right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older shall not be, sorry, I got to start that again. I got really confused. It says the rights of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied on account of age. Cool. So, can you vote? I just graduated from high school in Maryland, class of 72. I'm 18 years old, just got drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. Can I vote? Well, yeah, it's 1972, right? Yep, absolutely.